name is Zyra Castillio, and I was born in Cavite, or Kawit, Cavite, Philippines, and I live in Grand Rapids now. I was one of the very few people of color in general where I grew up, so I grew up in the Upper Peninsula. So I had basically a combined family situation, so the only Filipinos in my life growing up after 4 years old was my dad and my sister, who was half Filipino. One of the, I think, biggest challenges is just getting through with your identity, um, because your idea of yourself can really shape how you look at the world and how you move through it. So I was about 4 years old, um, actually about 4.5. So I came here in the middle of summer in Michigan, from the Philippines. So I remember specifically my first winter. I didn't know anything about snow, obviously, or how to play in snow. So the first thing I did was go head straight into a tree on a sled. So connecting to the Filipino community has been tricky for me. Not as much now, but in the very beginning, I said um, there weren't any other Filipinos around. I do remember when I was a kid, there was one Filipino girl. I think she moved, and I knew her in elementary school. She was a little older than me. She was the only other Filipino I knew in my school, and even in my own life. So I have a really complicated family dynamic, which I think a lot of Filipinos do with large families. I'm about the same age or a little bit older than a lot of my nieces and nephews, and so I had a few nephews who are like a fourth Filipino. So that was it for growing up. So I didn't really have any contact until college. I knew one Filipino person, and I was not involved in any Asian organizations because I still had a lot of marginalized communities internalize those biases about their own community. So I wanted nothing to do with the Asian student organization, and at the time, obviously, there's no Filipino organization because I was convinced I had to prove my Americanness by not associating with other Asian people in general, and that be including Filipino. Even though I still had Filipino pride, it was a weird conflict. That was freshman year and throughout college, eventually realizing that I actually wanted to embrace that. And I think college is very powerful in that way because then you're surrounded by a lot of different people. So my first connection in college is actually the internet, and I found a Filipino artist that I really liked. His name is Christian Cabway, and so I didn't know who he was at the time. He was reviving Babayan, and so I started, not exactly studying it, but really looking into that stuff. Because at the time, my life was Grand Valley, it was college, so I didn't know that there were Asian communities in Grand Rapids. So it wasn't until after college, when I was just about ready to leave Michigan in general, I started realizing there were other communities, and specifically, many communities of color in the city. Before they were called influencers, essentially these cultural influencers and teachers. And that was my first connection to the community, and finding out that there was a Filipino festival in Chicago, and I made connections to some of the cultural teachers there. And that's how I met other Asians in the Grand Rapids community. I had to leave it because I decided, we don't have a Filipino festival here. And at the time, we didn't have an Asian festival here. And so I wanted to get more involved. There are other Asians who wanted to get involved, and a lot of them are Filipino. And I think that's also a really unique thing, too, because if you look at the Asian community in Grand Rapids, a lot of the leaders happen to be Filipino and being very involved. And I think that's just a big part of Filipino culture. So if I lived in California, I think it'd be very different. But, Michigan and specifically Grand Rapids, I think I'm probably not the only one with a similar story to that. Well, as I was saying, like in the beginning, I guess a lot of negative ideas. So it didn't become positive until after college, I would say, or even like near the end of college, because I initially went to college for art and then became an art teacher. So I um, got my teaching degree. So I started learning more as a teacher. And at the time, I didn't even know how to relate to those other Asian artists because I didn't grow up with other Asian people. And so my outlook started changing once I started understanding their views. You can learn to understand yourself by observing others because there's things like instead of thinking that what you're doing is strange because you're the only person doing it, you realize that you are part of a culture. And as a kid not realizing some of the things that I did as a kid or even in that present time was associated with Filipino culture. I thought it was just something I did, like when I was really young. I got very self-conscious about calling my sister ate or using specific words because other people just thought it sounded weird. That made me self-conscious and think that that was strange. When you get to see yourself reflected in other people, then you start realizing that there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. I think that's kind of the power right now with social media is you can see a lot more people. So it took a while, but we're getting there. Over time, so my views of my cultural identity, um, I've always been proud of certain aspects of Filipino culture throughout my life. There are the other parts that I didn't understand before that now I understand better, including things that are hurtful. So I think especially with recent families coming over, your families are going through trauma and so you're you're in survival mode and sometimes the things you do to survive can feel very hurtful. And so understanding even some of the things I went through that felt painful, it doesn't mean I have to excuse what those things were. But I had negative feelings about it, thinking like that it was a bad reflection on Filipino culture. And that all cultures have some form of something that is toxic, but it really painted my view on Filipino culture and that kind of shame. And so learning about it helped me embrace it a lot more. With a lot of Filipinos, right? Most Filipinos are Catholic, and so I grew up. I guess I can say I was sort of homeschool Catholic, and I had like my little children's Bible and everything. Because of that, I was only learning Western spirituality, I guess you could say. And so I didn't learn anything about, ancestral practices because of the view that, this is what we are doing now. This is what you do to be spiritual or to be a good person. And so I didn't learn the other things that come from the culture. And I still don't know all of it. I'm still learning. That's where connecting to those cultural teachers was really powerful. Thinking about your ancestors and I guess being empowered by what they had gone through, I think is really powerful. Right now, there's a lot of things going on in the world, and it's very overwhelming, or even just what you're going through personally. But I think when you lose touch with like things like how your ancestors dealt with things, you're starting to miss all these other avenues of how you can deal with life and how you can see it. I definitely feel that once I started connecting to that part, it helped empower me.